Okay, bro, Leroy, we good.
And this is the Wisdom Table coming to you from the Grand Houses Community Radio Station in Harlem, USA. I'm Brother Leroy, the co-host on this show, and we have a part two to a guest who was here 2 days ago on the April 15th. But let's say this first. This show does not reflect the views, attitudes, whims, deeds, or any other proclivities of the Resident Association of Grand Houses. Neither does it reflect any of the views or positions taken by the management of this NYCHA development. However, the program does reflect the research done by the participants in the program, live and living in color in studio by phone interview. Today is Zoom, and it's part two of an interview with Dennis Speed of the LaRouche Political Action Committee. And in part one, we covered a lot of territory. For those of you who may have questions from that session, you're free to plug into our chat room. But in the meantime, thank you very much for joining us, Dennis Speed.
Happy to be here, sir.
And of course, we had indicated in our first program that you have been a person that we've gone to who's given explanation of what we are seeing in headlines or subheadlines, but not explained fully in the general media. So we'll start off again with COVID-19 and the socio-political aspects of it, primarily those things that there are press conferences, statewide, national, and there are various players in these conferences, and there are things that are not said, but with knowledge and understanding of what's going on behind the scenes, there's some things that don't have to be said, you can interpret them. So give us, Brother Dennis, what we are seeing but don't understand and what we're not seeing and should understand.
I think that it would be wise to entertain the hypothesis. In other words, not to assert as being true, but to entertain the hypothesis. That's different than mere possibility, but the hypothesis that what we are actually living in right now is an historically specific expression of what people often refer to as the end times. Now, when that term is usually used, it's used in a kind of generic sense, and it tends to be sometimes, as they say, even chiliastic, that is millenarian, as though a whole age or era is ending for all of human civilization. But it can also merely be an accurate expression of the sudden end, precipitous end of a dominant culture or civilization of a particular area of the world. What we are looking at in the case of the United States is that suddenly the veneer, the covering, the clothing, if you will, the costume has been ripped off to reveal the actual sorry state of the physical economy of the United States, also of Western Europe as well, what you could call the transatlantic world. That was the world that was created in particular after 1949 with NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And there's sort of a theory or a viewpoint that was entertained by the people that created that world, that they had become the dominant, quote unquote, civilization. This is generally blamed upon the United States because the United States was clearly the most important element of the military extension of power globally after the Second World War. But that would be inaccurate. because the most important power and the only actual superpower in the world during the period of the 1940s was the British Empire, not the United States. That reality is very hard for people today to understand or comprehend, but it was 75 years ago exactly that that new transatlantic order came into being. The reason that's relatively exact is that April 12th of 1945, 75 years ago, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died. And with his death, a new era came into being. This was under the apparent management of the Truman administration, but it really was way above Truman's pay grade, intellectual pay grade. What happened was that Roosevelt died, and then the 2 atomic bombs that the United States had were dropped on Japan. The reason that Roosevelt's vice president had been replaced by Harry Truman in 1944 was precisely because the previous vice president, Henry Wallace, would never have dropped the bombs on Japan. The dropping of the bombs on Japan was the beginning of another era of human, or at least of latter-day human civilization. That was 75 years ago. And that era is now drawing to a close of transatlantic domination of the globe by British intelligence and American muscle. That's the way they talked about it at the time, at that era. The way it's drawing to a close is very unceremonious. If you look at the United States, we now have in the state of New Jersey the same number of deaths associated with COVID-19 or the coronavirus as such, which is a different number. The COVID-19 is the disease. We have the same number of deaths in New Jersey as they had in all of China. If you take the state of New York, you start looking at the combination of deaths in the United States. China had said it had 3,300 deaths. Even if you said China's lying, absolutely, they covered up, and you said they had double that number of deaths, or they had triple that number of deaths, or you even said they had 10 times that number of deaths, that number of deaths you would come up with, even if you claimed that their death total was 10 times higher somehow, they had 10 times as many bodies, which would be very difficult to hide, especially from the National Security Agency. But even if that were true, that would be equivalent to the death toll in the United States right now. And the United States is 1/4 the size of China. In other words, China would have to have over 100,000 people dead to just be as bad as the United States is right now. And we're just getting started in this. Now, the danger that's happening, the issue that's happening is that the people who have run this utterly bankrupt system way before Donald Trump and way before Barack Obama and way before George Bush Jr., in fact, but these people recognize that their world has come to an end. They are prepared in order for them to attempt to return to power, if necessary, to launch nuclear war, thermonuclear war, against China and Russia, for which they are now beginning to prepare the American population and others. And that is the reason for the claim that the coronavirus is a Chinese biological weapon. That is why that is being said. It has a purpose. And the purpose is to get you ready for where they're actually going. It's got 2 phases. First will be the spread of the virus into Africa, India, and South America in general, and other parts of Asia. This will kill millions in the present circumstance. And that will create a tremendous amount of social disruption, but it will also create great problems for raw materials and strategic minerals flows around the world. Will mean that whoever has the military capabilities basically will call the shots in a world sort of dominated by this hell of pestilence that will be allowed to run rampant, because it will kill a lot of Black, brown, and yellow people, which is the purpose of allowing it to run rampant. But that's only the first phase. The phase they're getting ready for, their view is, unless they can subjugate China and Russia as well, unless they can do that, their system can't survive. And so, as was done at the time of the Adolf Hitler, they will attempt to deploy their military for the purpose of looting the labor force and whatever raw materials, but primarily the financial holdings that exist in China, which of course is now the most powerful economy in the world. So that's the truth of what has happened. And so the veil has been lifted. The reason you're seeing all these deaths in the United States is because that's how physically run down the population, the infrastructure, and the living conditions of the United States are. It is a sad, it's sort of like looking at the body of a crystal meth addict who still has a view of themselves as being whatever, handsome or beautiful or in shape. But you get to see the real body. And that is what has happened in a mere 1 month in the United States.
Where have you, if at all, where have you seen articles or columns verifying or supporting what you just laid out?
Well, there's several things that you can look at to verify it, but all I have to do is look at the morgue figures. I mean, in other words, you've got now 10,000 people dead in New York City of a disease in 2020. You know, you might have expected that in New York City back in 1813, but the very fact that that could occur when in a society which spends between $1 and $2 trillion on military defense and has had its own biological, biochemical, and chemical warfare programs ever since the 1940s, or earlier, actually. The very fact that that would happen, that's what tells you about it. You don't need an article to justify or to demonstrate what you're seeing. It's just that people would prefer not to see what they're seeing. You just emptied out. You now have officially 25 million people who declared unemployment within a period of basically 2 months. You're now officially, you can look in the Washington Post and so on, you're at Great Depression levels of unemployment. But this is not caused by a depression, apparently. It's caused by a virus for which you have no cure. So you have no prospect of seeing the end of this. And if you send people back out to work, well, what's going to happen is you're going to get either reinfection or relapses, or you're going to get a massive spread of the disease. That doesn't mean they're not mad enough not to do it. They may do it. But you're in a situation in which, as I said, it's a form of the end times, the axioms of the society, the theory, the ideology has failed. And that's why it's so difficult for people to face it. In other words, everything that you have thought about what you thought was economic reality is now going to be proven wrong.
Let's go to 1985 when your organization put out a projection. The pandemic Was the narrative?
Yes, economic breakdown and the threat of global pandemics. It was something we wrote up in July 1st, 1985, but that was itself a report about an 11-year earlier study. And what we were looking at is, and this would have been familiar to anybody who was active politically, maybe not as merely against the Vietnam War, but if you were active in what was known in many different names back then. It was the Black Nationalist movement, the Pan-African movement. It was a movement, of course, differently associated with the Nation of Islam. Even the Panther Party had a kind of conception of this. All of these, and also independently of all that, there were people even in the NAACP, like Whitney Young or others, who periodically referenced this reality. What had happened was that in the aftermath of the assassinations in particular, the United States had taken a downturn economically. And this was best seen, or could be easily seen, in New York, certain other areas. And what was circulated at that time in the form of a book called The Choice, The Issue of Black Survival in America, was a thesis which was that Black people were no longer needed in America because it had become post-industrial. And since it was post-industrial, it was no longer going to be involved in manufacturing in any really or significant way. That had been decided that would be turned off because Black people had come into the cities last and had just begun to become significantly capitalized in some of the factory-based culture, if you will, factory-based activity of that time. They would find that they were essentially expendable. They were redundant to the economy, as the Nazis used to say, Heinrich Himmler's term from his famous Green File to describe whole sections of the Eastern European population as being redundant to the Nazi war machine. And so people back then recognized that there were policies to destroy sections of America. We called it urban removal. And what that referenced was the process that you see right now in New York City, where you've had 90 hospitals, 90 hospitals closed in the last 50 years. So the true reason that you were having the problems that you got when you got the virus was because of the combination of closed hospitals, underfunding of hospitals, abandonment of significant programs to create community-based medical care. And this was a policy that it was called the HMO, or Health Maintenance Organization policy, started under the Nixon administration as part of that cutting back of and depopulation of Black areas in particular, and to some degree also increasingly brown areas. So the policy was called different things back then. You had the King Alfred Plan, you had different names that were given to it. And of course, people were accused of being paranoid and so forth and so on. But it was nonetheless the case that under the Defense Production Act in part, but also under the House Un-American Activities Committee, which wrote a report back there called, in May of 1968, called Guerrilla Warfare in the United States, the plans were made very clear about cordoning off ghetto areas, shutting them down, putting them under a form of surveillance, which right now, of course, is easily done with the cell phone. And the point of saying all this is that Wall Street policy, the City of London policy today, the financial policies, the fact that you could issue $6.5 trillion, basically, virtually overnight, with $4 trillion of it going ostensibly to corporate debt, and $2.5 trillion approximately supposedly going to small businesses and being given out as a check to the population. Everybody should have known as soon as they were told they were going to get a $1,200 check. The question is, how much am I paying? How many multiples of $1,200 am I paying on the back end to get that check? So you're in a circumstance where the pandemics began to break out already in the mid-70s. The HIV pandemic was similar. It was suppressed in the transatlantic world, but was allowed to continue to run in Africa. Where we are now is that a policy shift has come. And that policy shift is that the City of London financial establishment, together with portions of Wall Street, have decided that the populations of the transatlantic sector themselves will be sacrificed in order to try to reorganize the globe with approximately 5 to 6 billion less people. And that is also the true significance of the so-called global warming. You know, we've got to somehow go to solar power. We've got to somehow get rid of industry. Because of course, the people who are using coal-fired plants are in China and in Africa. And if they don't have coal-fired plants and you try to go to solar, then you will depopulate those areas by billions. So the idea is to give the people who are not from those areas the moral delusion that they are doing something for the planet. So they will commit a burnt offering of many, many millions and hundreds of millions of people into the billions to, quote, save the planet. They will commit a Holocaust approximately 100 to 1,000 times worse than Hitler because they're trying to save the planet. So that's what's going on.
Okay, the what you just said, just dealing with that by setting in place a policy, it would automatically have a domino effect of the illnesses and the death of people in certain areas, and certain policies don't have to be worldwide. They can be regionalized or target to a region or target to a populated Africa or India. And is that what?
That's already happened. You see, Africa keeps growing in population despite all this. So many things have happened in the last 50 years in Africa. And if you were to listen to merely the so-called European press and the press here, it's all bad. Except the only thing is, back in 1980, when we were all talking about famine in Africa and what we had to do about it, population of that continent was about 500 million people. Today, it's 1.3 billion. Yes, perhaps as many, certainly over 50 million people, but perhaps as many as 100 million have in fact died there in that same period. But it kept growing. And so if you look at that and you look at India, which has a very particular orientation, it's different. Of course, that's not a continent, that's a subcontinent. Remember that you can fit the United States, India, and China into the continent of Africa and most of Western Europe as well. So just to have a difference in terms of both the size and the scale. So when we talk about 1.2 billion people in Africa, you've got 1.4 billion people just in China. So if you were to talk about it comparably, you'd have to have 5 billion people almost in Africa, 4 billion, 3.9 billion to be equivalent. So the African, and remember the population of Africa, the median age of the population is 19 years. The median age of the population here is about 38. Germany is about 42, 43. So this is where the world is going to grow. Everybody knows that's why China's there. Everybody knows the future of the world is in the continent of Africa, and the development of cities, the shift from the countryside into the cities, and so forth. Well, what that will mean is that the fulcrum of power is also going to shift necessarily. And there are many people, particularly because of the old British colonial outlook, whose view is that you are not going to have independent, sovereign Black nations under any circumstances that are, in fact, economically sovereign and competitive with anything in the transatlantic world. That just is not going to be allowed. And if that means going to thermonuclear war to stop that, they will do that.
They call it low intensity warfare, right?
Well, it was called that. That's Brigadier General Frank Kitson, and it refers to something he did in specific during the 1950s against Jomo Kenyatta. It was a form of warfare in which what you did was you did not engage in any frontal assault unless really necessary, like, for example, bombing portions of Southwest Africa with anthrax or something like that in the middle of an insurgency. But they don't want to do that. That's the way you don't, that becomes exposed. You get protests. It becomes obvious. The thing we're looking at, that we're living in, that people are living in here, which is why I'm going through this, is that let's take what you would need to do here. Right now, you need to turn the entire US economy around and produce massive amounts of infrastructure to rebuild the United States. You have to redo the entire, for example, water system of New York City, just alone. You have to create high-speed rail across this country because you've got a decrepit rail system. You want to get rid of a lot of the automobile traffic or trucking traffic in particular, not because of just environmental reasons or something, but because it's inefficient. You have to build. Look at Houston or New Orleans and what happened there because of the problems of flood control. How about the drought in California, which is largely caused by the non-implementation of plans that JFK had back in the time of the North American Water and Power Alliance? People say, oh, it's the sun. It's ridiculous. No, it's you. It's the fact that we never did what we were supposed to do back in the 1960s. California was always arid. It always had desert. That changed in the during the Great Depression and after the Second World War, when we irrigated the Imperial Valley and made it one of the most productive areas in the world. You have to desalinate water off the coast of California, and you do that with small scale, what are called fourth generation nuclear power reactors. They're much smaller than the others, lots safer. These things have been designed way long ago. But the reason that it's not done and isn't going to be done is that there's another agenda. Now, that can change. And if it does not change, I want people to be very clear about what I'm saying. The economy that has been, quote, shut down is never going to be opened up in the form that people are thinking. Because a lot of the merchants had such debt, they can't reopen. They don't how are they supposed to survive? It was already a just-in-time paycheck to paycheck economy. So if you're paycheck to paycheck and you kept in for 2 months, you show up, is your business still there? Okay, in some cases it will be true. It will be. But what's the plan exactly? Especially given that the disease is still there. So you have to have a walking away from the past 50 years of failed economic theory. What you're going to do is go back to manufacturing, to mining, and agriculture, including growing food right in Long Island, growing food right in different parts of Queens, and so forth, so that people are eating fresh food that doesn't have to be moved more than 50 miles to them. So you're talking about, throwing out the theory about, the computerized world, we're all going to work at home. That's not going to happen. That's over. People thought it was just beginning. No, it's actually over, or you're over. And so this is the problem. Trump, who is president, and you can't change it in midstream at this point. I'm not talking about the election. I'm talking about right now. Is surrounded by people who are attempting to loot people, the banks and so on. Again, they got $4 trillion. Last time they only got officially $880 billion. So we've got that. That's going on. But at the same time, people are not happy about dying. So there's an actual possibility. Remember that he talked about a $2 trillion infrastructure program. Well, if you spent $2 trillion right now on infrastructure and prepared to spend another $2 trillion next year on infrastructure, and you wanted to start to put millions of Americans to work in that new form of work, people say, well, they won't do it because they don't like the jobs. Oh, they will prefer that to dying. So in fact, that's what I'm saying has to occur. And if it does not, this is very short term. You got to see it yourselves. So you don't have to worry about whether you believe me or not. If you do not do this, there is no way for the United States to actually survive, not with this population size. You want to talk about an America that has 200 million people in it instead of 350 million people in it? Yeah, maybe. But guess who is going to be missing in that census? Look in the mirror. So this is the thing we're faced with. That's the actual circumstance. That's actually, quote, today's news.
Okay, COVID-19. How does that play? Is that something that occurs at the same time as a plan that was in place, or is it part of the execution of a plan?
Well, you see, this is an interesting question because it's not that it's not that a biological weapon could not be unleashed. So let me just be very clear with people, because that happened with the anthrax thing back in 2001, which a lot of people have forgotten about, time of 9/11. And there was a, quote, anthrax through the mail, and about 5 or 6 people died. There were a lot of people got infected. About 25, 50 people got infected. And the FBI, quote, solved the case by finding one guy that they claimed he had been working at Fort Detrick, and they claimed that he committed suicide just as they closed in on him. And he was supposed to be the anthrax killer, except the problem involved is that what he was using was a weapons grade anthrax that was ground so fine that it literally would get into the cells of the lung tissue. It would be breathed. It was so finely milled. And Fort Detrick, the second in command there, was interviewed by a man by the name of Bob Cohen for a documentary he did. The commander there said, "This is a product we can't make at Fort Detrick." And there were only 3 places in the world: Porton Down in London, there was a factory in Russia, and there was a factory out in the west of the United States. So yes, there have been weapons, bioweapons, that have been used, including recently. So I'm not saying that you couldn't have something like that, but this is different, because what this is the use of something that actually doesn't presently have a cure. You say, well, there's a vaccine. And I'll tell you how you'll know that it doesn't. You see, let's assume that this was a bioweapon and it was came from, quote, the Chinese. Well, then if you really were saying that all these Americans were being killed by the Chinese, then what you would do, if you truly believed that, you would have entered into secret negotiations with China, and you would have said, give us the antidote. We know this is a bioweapon. If you don't give us the antidote, then there's going to be war. But more importantly, we know you have something. And then what would happen is this would be rolled out in certain time, as though vaccine has been. That hasn't been done. So the people who claim that, because remember, these are people like Pompeo. Pompeo hasn't quite exactly said that. He's gotten close to saying that. Notice that Trump did not attack China. He attacked the World Health Organization, which was also wrong, but he did that, right, in lieu of attacking China. That's what that was about. But British intelligence called for him to attack China. This former head of British intelligence, John Sawyers, who was head of British intelligence from 2009, I believe, until 2013, MI6. He said, no, that's not good enough. Got to be China. So people are instigating something. And here's the more frightening idea that nobody really wants to entertain, that it doesn't have a cure. And there are people in the financial establishment who, knowing that, are trying to deploy it into Africa and into Asia And that's why they want the United States battling with China, because China's all over Africa. America's all over Africa militarily. They're not helping anybody with their economies, but they're doing stuff militarily. And you're going to begin to get tens of thousands of deaths. So you could stop it. But if you were working for a financial establishment whose goal had been to depopulate the planet, what that establishment will say is, well, no, wait a minute. Let's let this go for a while. Now, if we're going to let it go for a while, we got to have conflict going on here, because it's in the interest of China in particular to have a healthy African population with which it's actually interacting. So that's what's going on. People, you said it. You said you want the truth. I'll tell you the truth.
Okay, just to go back a second for the audience who are not aware of the book, The Choice, The Issue of Black Survival in America by Samuel Yet. One of the main values of that book is that Samuel Yet, as I understand it, was a reporter who was assigned to Washington hearings, or, just keeping abreast of the Senate and the House matters. And in the course of going in and out of hearings, he was picking up information relative to the internment of Black people in America, outside of any riots or anything like that. Am I remembering correctly?
Yes, and he also published in that book some material from the late Cornelius Gallagher. Neil Gallagher was a member of the House of Representatives from New Jersey, just died actually about a year ago. I knew him well. Matter of fact, some friends of mine were working on a biography of him. And I talked with Mr. Gallagher, and his daughter actually remembers this vividly now, that he was the one, and from that book, from Samuel Yet's book, you'll see he has a whole section where Gallagher's the one that helped to uncover the material, including from the House Un-American Activities Committee of '68, which documented these attempts to do the internment of African Americans, including the civil rights. Everybody was basically going to be rounded up that form or posed any form of threat whatsoever. So yes, and you're right. I believe he worked for Newsweek, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
Yes, and he was just a reporter. But of course, back then you could be that. There was a brief period of time in the United States. We know it may sound to people today as though it's impossible, but you are actually able to do actual journalism, even if you were attached to Newsweek magazine or even the New York Times, as Seymour Hersh would be able to tell you. Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, Dennis.
Yes.
Yeah, Brother LEROY lost his microphone for a second. But I got a question for you. When you were on last time, you were, and as you said earlier in the interview, you were talking about the ways that they have been trying to put back the economy, which I agree with you. I don't see how they're going to be able to put that back together. But my question is that, what do you make of these people who are like from Fox News or in other places, or the people I saw in Michigan who are walking around acting like that there is no virus? What do you? I mean, in the name of economics, what do you are you saying that's part of them going down the path towards this pseudo-economic doom, so to speak?
Well, I'll tell you what I will say to you about that. Are we all right? Are we still recording?
Yeah, we're good.
All right, good. Well, you get a phenomenon. You realize that there is a very, very bad form of American exceptionalism. There's one good form of it, and there's a very bad form of it. And it's well known to people in, for example, the African American community, some people in the poor white community. And the notion is they would never do that to us. It can't really, right? Okay, you got it. So I don't say more. That's it.
You know,
That's
that's interesting you said that, because as you know, when you're African American or whatever,
Black,
when you're black, you have a very strong sense of how they operate. I mean, even though it doesn't flow to the forefront of the culture or on the mainstream stuff, because I believe most of the mainstream people are on TV because they're there to pay their rent. You're not there to tell anything remotely towards any truth. They're there to do. They're on the job. And when you say that, you kind of when you see them running out there, you say to themselves, "Wow, they must be out of their mind," because they will do that to them. They will do it to anyone that gets in their way, because when they are, to me, are infected with winning. And I listened to you very carefully the last time you were on, and you were talking about the oligopolists and how silly they are. And I liken it to, I used to be a basketball player, and when you're playing, you're winning, you don't give a crap about what anybody else is talking about in your peer group, because you're beating them.
Right.
And so when you're winning economically, why are you paying attention to them? I'm just a little taken aback by the people who they're not winning. Maybe they think they're winning, but they're not really winning.
Right.
And I don't really understand how they're just falling for this.
Well, there's a couple of problems. It's not a matter of it merely being racial or something. It's a culture. Correct. And of course, look, the reason that you will tend to find, particularly in the latter part post King and Malcolm, that many of the primary intellectuals among Black people have tended to be comedians, is because the comedians have, of course, recognized what I mean. They just have found a way to use what is recognized. They recognize that it's very dangerous to put forward ideas in America any longer. So what they will do is they will guise it. And Chappelle, for example, tends to be very good at this kind of thing.
Yeah, he is.
Richard was the one, Richard Pryor was the one that gave people the license to get into it. You may have some problems, I think, or we all would say, yeah, maybe he didn't have to do it the way he did it, but he was Richard. And so Richard did what he did the way he did.
I liked it. I was liking it.
I'm just saying, right? He did.
Me too.
That's the way it was, right?
Yeah.
And that was very liberating at the time for the people that needed to be liberated at that time. And so if you look at Dick Gregory, for example, or others, and of course Dick was there from the beginning, so to speak.
Yes.
And sort of whatever we want to say, and obviously everybody changes, everybody has certain. But I take this up in this way to try to get this across to people, and I hope everyone will understand this in the spirit with which it's said. The Chinese have made one unavoidable mistake. The Chinese, unlike what happened with the Soviet Union, when it all disappeared, right, disintegrated back in 1991, the Chinese were confronted with something very similar at that same time. 1989, Tiananmen Square. You may remember that, right?
Yes, I do.
10,000 people got killed in the square and all this, and it's all this, we want democracy, blah, blah, blah. So it looked like Chinese government might even fall. And what they did instead was they said, we're not doing that. What we're going to do, because they'd already begun some reforms, economic reforms anyway, said what we're actually going to do is we're going to base ourselves on the historical American economy, which is the economy of Abraham Lincoln, and how Lincoln was able to build a U.S. economy stronger than the slave economy, to beat the slave economy, and came out of the war, even with 600,000 people dead, with an economy that was more productive than when he went in. And this got everybody's attention in the world at the time. Okay, I mean, everybody saw it because they would have assumed that the United States would have been devastated. And what Lincoln had done was he had used the greenback policy. That is, he took his United States Treasury and he issued credit and he financed the war by creating this highly productive military machine, but it knew how to do things like build railroad very quickly. He then took that same technology. In fact, it was the very year he came in, one of the first things that Abraham Lincoln did after he got elected to the presidency, it was done in the first month of his presidency, was to issue the order for the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. This doesn't sound like a big thing today, but that was the same thing back then as like the NASA project. That's like saying that's what it felt like to people.
Yeah.
You're going to unify the whole continent. He did this. Now, I'm saying all this to say, Germany studied this. Russia studied it at the time. China studied it. This was the Sun Yat-sen in particular, and many other countries. And that's what they did. And Japan. So that's the real American economy, not the Wall Street economy. The Wall Street economy is a later thing. There was, and Lincoln didn't go to the banks. He refused to go to the banks. He issued, because the banks were talking about 23% to 30% interest on what they were going to loan him for the war. He knew that meant that the country would then be in hock to those banks. So he financed his own war, and then he said he was going to do his reconstruction the same way. At that point, plus giving Black soldiers the right to vote, those two things. Once those two things became clear, he had to go, sit, okay? And so I'm saying that to say this to you. The Chinese have made the unpardonable error. The one thing you must not do, you must not excel. Your economy must not become better than, more productive than let's say the European transatlantic world. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Okay. Can't do it. Not allowed. Because once you do that, once you see that, because now, right? And it's worth going for those people who think that way. And we're talking about these oligarchical families, a lot of different names attached to it. Windsor's is one name attached to it. Habsburg's is another name attached to it. Rothschild's is another name attached to it. Back in there's other families like the Sassoon family. Remember Vidal Sassoon?
Yes.
That's an old family, goes back. They try to trace themselves back to Egypt. We would dispute that. But, that kind of thing. That's what we're talking about. These people and other families that people never really hear of, who have the same kind of pedigree. So these are people who believe that the United States is just a flash in the pan. It's been 250 years. That's nothing, right? There are families older than that, right? The Turner-Taxis family, for example, can trace its roots back, 500 years. So you talking about you've been around 250 years, that means nothing to the families, let alone the imperial forces. So what is up is this: where we are as of tonight, as of today, we don't have to go down that road. And there are people who can lead the initiative. It's possible. Look, if you get Russia, China, India, the United States together, and they just do it like this, we got to save the people from the disease. So here's what we're going to do. We got to have clean water. We got to have good food. We got to have the ability to export these things to people. We have to have power, because you got to be able to power the hospital and the electricity for the hospitals. We have to have power for the factories. So what we're doing is we're going to take our conflicts. We're going to suppress them for the moment, because we've got to solve this. Therefore, we need an economy that does that. And what the United States would do is what it did in the Second World War, except this time it's not a wartime mobilization, except against a war against the disease. But what that does, if you do it, is suddenly oligarchies are not being listened to. People that have derivatives payments are not being listened to. All that financial funny money is not important, because it doesn't have anything physically attached to it. And it's on the basis of that, you can steal a march, and you can march these people out of power. That is where we are. And that is the only way, actually, the majority of people are going to survive.
Wow, it's interesting that you say that, because when you, when I was in grad school, our economics professor asked everybody in the class, did anybody know what capitalism meant? Everybody raised their hand with various, silly things out of the book. And he shot down everything and he said, the goal of capitalism is to fuck the other guy before he fucks you. This is what he said. I never forgot that. And when you think, and the reason why I'm saying that is because when you really think about what they're really doing now, they're not acting like the disease ain't the disease. I mean, you get a guy who's a clear-cut liar who's in charge of who's the titular head, and he gets up there and he's lies, and they don't call him on it. Mm-hmm. They ask to quantify his lies, and clearly he's an avatar for the things that the oligopolists, the things that run the culture. But when the culture can't even correct itself, how do you come around to the other side of this without someone that's going to be able to tell people and get people to believe in the truth? I mean, how does that happen in your opinion, Dennis?
Well, let me say the following. As you know, I've been associated with Lyndon LaRouche from 1970 was when I first met him. That's 50 years. Okay, now he died last year, 2019. I wasn't in his organization at the beginning. We just coming around from the Black Student Union at Swarthmore College and that whole thing. People taking over buildings and cultural centers and things like that, of which I became part. Wasn't in the original thing, but I was there the year after. And so you're hearing everybody, right? Because people are coming to the universities then, right? And things are very active. The Vietnam War is raging. And then we're finding out about the My Lai massacre. We have the whole thing with COINTELPRO, which happens coming out of the right. Well, that's May 4th of 1970, right? And the COINTELPRO thing is exposed out of Media, Pennsylvania, and the first school that gets a copy of what these people did was Swarthmore College, where I was, because the students and professors that did it, they were from Haverford and Bryn Mawr. And they pretended to be from Swarthmore when they went to the Media, Pennsylvania office. And so they dropped off the first results that they had from their files. They began reading the files. They didn't realize what they had quite gotten. I think it was an Ali fight going on at the time, I believe, that night. I think that's what was happening. And they knew that the FBI office would basically be empty. They went and got the files, and they dropped off files, and basically the entire Black Student Union was being investigated by the FBI, like all of us. Okay, and, we weren't dangerous, really. We had a posture. we were trying to be bad, but we found all of us are being investigated. So I'm just saying that. Therefore, that was how I met Lyndon LaRouche, and at that time, what he was doing, which was unique among everybody, was that he had an economic theory, and his thing was, listen, this whole thing is coming down. He said, this whole thing is coming down, and frankly, it's going to come down soon. So when the dollar was taken off the gold standard, when that happened in August 15th of 1971, those of us who had studied Economics 101, gone through the Paul Samuelson book and all these things, realized that this was the event they said could never occur. He said the Bretton Woods system, the system set up in 1944 at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, which became the international monetary system with the dollar as the basis of world credit, had built-in stabilizers. It would never be rocked. You were never going to get back to the Depression. Never, ever, ever going to happen. And then Nixon took the dollar off gold, not because Nixon came up with it, but because he was advised by George Shultz, who was Secretary of Treasury at the time. He had replaced Connolly. Okay, remember that Connolly got shot in the car with JFK. So right. he had replaced Connolly. Shultz had replaced him. Shultz is still alive, by the way. He's still hanging out. He's still here. And so what happened was that's what happened. Nixon did that. He floated the dollar. The dollar went from $39 to an ounce of gold up to about $150 to an ounce of gold about 2 months later. And so everything was out of kilter. And now they started to do what they call phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 in the economy. It was a way that they started to take people through austerity. They were going to make welfare recipients work for $1.60 an hour. They're going to work for their check. It was going to be called workfare, not welfare. And so we recognized this, those of us who were young students at the time, that LaRouche had been right. So we said, well, let's get with this guy because he knows what's going to happen. And so we began fighting at that time, and it was in 1974. In other words, only 3 years after Nixon did this, we came out with an analysis which was called the Biological Holocaust Task Force. And our thing was that Robert McNamara had said that there was a whole area of Africa and a whole area of Asia, and they redlined it. They said, don't give these people loans because it's no use. Between what their economic conditions are going to be made to be, they're just going to die. So we're going to write them off. We're calling them the fourth world. So he made up this term, the fourth world. And so we began our fight back then against what we called at the time, right, universal fascism. And so globalization was a form of that. Other things are a form of that. What can be done about this is that you notice I'm still around and other people because of what he taught us and what we learned from him through those years. And so we do have publications and so on. We have an emergency alert system, we call it. And we're saying, and that's what we do. And if you go to our website, you'll see all the advertisements for that. People should get it. It's a daily briefing that we do. Different members you'll see of us, like Harley Schlanger, that some people know. Harley joined back then, same time I did. Other people go back that far. But the answer to your question, finally, what do? It's only usually when you get exactly the situation we're in that you can go around these people, because they have lost the mantle of heaven. They are no longer the authority. They cannot provide for the people. And when the people who've been telling the people, bamboozling them, bushwhacking them intellectually, okay, but buffaloing them, okay, befuddling them, when those people are suddenly seen to have no power to deliver any form of goods, and you're dying by the tens and hundreds and thousands in the United States, at that time, and only at that time, unfortunately, do voices like the voices of Brother Leroy and myself or other people, that's when they're heard.
Wow. Well, as you're talking, there's something playing on the screen where they're showing, how many deaths that they have, and again, I always think of what I'm seeing as akin to the movie Jaws, where the officer was complaining that that there was a problem, where they brought in a specialist. Richard Dreyfuss played the specialist guy, and he was saying, we got a big problem here. And the shark is like the criminal, the virus, and everybody and you had the towns, the mayor and all of the town saying, we got to open the beach up. We got to keep opening the beach up. And they wouldn't listen to anyone until they saw that people were dying and the people turned on them. And so I'm saying that this sounds a lot like that movie where all of these things are going on, and they're telling people we got to open the beach up by July 4th. That's what the guy kept saying in the movie. But here they say we got to open up the country. They have cure, no vaccine, no protocol, no nothing, and they're just going out there, raw dogging as the kids say. Nothing to cover yourself. And I'm going to say this part. What I've learned over the years is that whenever there's a lot of dying, I don't care whose family it is, there's always a way of people expressing their grief. There's always some finger pointing in the family about stuff.
Right.
And I'm kind of believing that you're right, because I think people are going to turn on these guys because they haven't told them the truth. They have no solution, yet the only thing they're thinking about is the money. And they gave everybody a whole bunch of money, but there's no way to spend it other than food and liquor and weed.
Right.
I mean, there's nothing, unless you order something online. So even the currency is not as valuable as it once was when you compare it to your life. What do you think about that? And then we're going to wrap it up.
Yeah, exactly. But you hit everything pretty precisely. And I think that the image you gave is important. I think the thing we want to remember is that the reason we can win is because these people are wrong. See, there is such a thing as, a higher force in the universe. Whatever is, you don't have to believe in it. It's just necessary for it to be there. So it doesn't really matter if people believe it. I mean, it does matter because you have a different way of operating if you believe it. And if you understand what your relationship is, which does not have to be mystical, it can actually be scientific. And you stand for a principle. That's what I learned from Lyndon LaRouche. And just to come back to this, because this is of relevance. You see, yes, you are mortal. You're going to die at some point, but there's a way to do something that connects you to history and to the future, so that there's a form of immortality, which is not your fame necessarily. It can come in that form, certain people, it does come in that form. But what you really can do is take right now, this moment. What can we do? Here's what we can do. We can have an emergency reconstruction program for health for our country and for the world. We could basically, in other words, decide we're going to produce hospitals, we're going to produce the equipment, we're going to produce the vaccine, we're going to produce the water system and the food supply that are going to allow people to become healthy again. So this is something that would take hundreds of billions of dollars. It takes a lot of people. Look at the state of infrastructure. It's big for the American people. It's them going to work. It's them having a sustainable, durable survival based not only on employment, but also export. And you can work that out. You take China. China's got $1 trillion of our U.S. treasuries. You think they want the dollar to go down? No, what they would accept is you could do what's called forward-based contracting. You could tell them right now, we're going to produce for you tractors. They need to have a big need for that. And undercarriages for their high-speed rail. They need to have a big need for that. So we're going to produce that, take our defense plants. We're going to use those we got. We're going to reopen some other stuff. Now, you will not get this stuff for 4 years or 5 years or 7 years. About 7 years, about the limit. But you're going to pay us now for this because we are going to restart production. And we've got to be able to pay the necessary vendors, the secondary vendors, to get this to happen.
Upfront cost.
Boom. Okay, so that's the deal. That's the kind of thing we can do. We can do this. See, and the world's going to want us doing this because the world don't want a crazy United States with a whole lot of nuclear weapons. See, so we got a way to work this out. But frankly, you got to get people that have the vision to see that. And in the American people can see it. But honestly, look to the Black population. You got to look to the Black population because people understand it already. You don't have to teach it. There's not a learning curve on this.
That's true. Dennis Speed, do you have a website where people can come and get some of your teachings and do further research for those who operate in this realm of skepticism?
Well, I'm going to say this. Just for people who are going to do DennisHSpeed@yahoo.com. That's my own personal email. You can do that. DennisHSpeed@yahoo.com. Now, you can also go to the LaRouche Political Action Committee site. LaRouche Pub is a good place for research. LaRouche Publications. Go there because you can get a lot of the background stuff. You just put in different things. But again, you can always check me out. I will be on a LaRouche Pack tomorrow.
Okay.
We'll be doing a program actually on this whole health thing. It's going to be at 2:00 tomorrow. I'll be live. And if you go to the top of the site, just put in LaRouche Pack, they'll have a little advertisement up there probably right now. And I'll be doing that program. I'll be moderating a program with a couple of other individuals, but we'll be taking questions and doing stuff with that.
Okay.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Very good.
Now, all right. Listen, I'd like to say this on behalf of Brother Leroy. I want to thank you for coming on again and wowing us with your expertise and your razor sharp mind and very smooth talking. Very impressive, I must say. And I want to say, as Brother Leroy say, God bless you and your family for coming on. And I want to tell all the people out there, if they're listening, they're tuning in next time, they might just learn something. Thank you so much, Dennis.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to have been on.
Peace, man.
Peace.